The Los Baños Raid. On February 23, 1945, inside Los Baños internment camp, 40 miles south of Manila in the Philippines, over 2,000 civilian prisoners woke to another day of starvation, where men who once weighed 180 pounds had withered down to barely 90, and women's ribs pressed visibly through their skin, while children suffered from swollen bellies caused by severe malnutrition. The camp sat on an old agricultural college campus surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and 250 Japanese soldiers who had been reducing daily rations to just 80 calories, which was barely enough to keep prisoners breathing, much less functioning after 3 years of increasingly brutal captivity. American intelligence learned the Japanese planned to massacre everyone before Allied forces could arrive, so General Douglas MacArthur approved an emergency rescue mission that would require perfect timing and flawless coordination between 3 different forces. The plan was bold in its coordination because U.S. paratroopers from the 511th Regiment would drop directly onto the camp at exactly 7 a.m., while amphibious tractors carrying infantry would cross Laguna de Bay and storm the beach from another direction. And Filipino guerrillas would attack from the jungle to create a 3-pronged assault, hitting simultaneously when Japanese guards would be outside doing morning calisthenics without their weapons nearby. At 7 a.m. on February 23rd, 9 C-47 transport planes roared over the camp at 500 feet, and 130 paratroopers dropped into rice fields just outside the wire with their boots hitting the ground running, while 54 amphibious tractors roared onto the beach, crushing through vegetation as Filipino guerrillas burst from the tree line with rifles firing in a coordinated attack. The Japanese guards were caught outside in their exercise uniforms without access to their weapons and scrambled desperately for the barracks. But gunfire cut them down in seconds before they could mount any organized defense. Paratroopers stormed through the gate shouting for prisoners to get out, and starving civilians stumbled into daylight, with many shielding their eyes from the sun they hadn't seen in years because they were too weak to walk on their own. Soldiers lifted them onto their shoulders and carried them to the amphibious tractors, though some prisoners refused to leave because they were convinced it was a Japanese trick, until paratroopers set fire to the remaining barracks to force them out and make clear this was their only chance at survival. The entire extraction took 2 hours from start to finish, and when the last amphibious tractor pulled away from the beach, the camp was completely empty, except for smoke rising from burning buildings and the bodies of Japanese soldiers scattered across the compound. All 2,147 prisoners were rescued without a single civilian casualty, while only 3 American soldiers and 2 Filipino guerrillas died in the operation compared to over 200 Japanese soldiers killed, making it one of the most successful rescue operations in military history and a textbook example of coordination, timing, and overwhelming force applied at exactly the right moment. The miracle of Dunkirk. On May 26, 1940, over 400,000 British and French soldiers were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk in northern France, after German panzer tanks had smashed through Allied defenses in just 2 weeks and driven the British Expeditionary Force against the coast where the sea was at their backs. The German army was closing in from 3 sides, and Luftwaffe bombers circled overhead, dropping bombs onto the sand, while soldiers crouched behind abandoned trucks and equipment waiting to die because there seemed to be no way out of this disaster. Winston Churchill ordered Operation Dynamo, the largest military evacuation in history. But the Royal Navy quickly realized they had a serious problem, because while they had destroyers available, Dunkirk's harbor had been destroyed by German bombs that shattered the docks into twisted metal and concrete, which meant large ships couldn't reach the beaches since the water was too shallow for deep draft vessels to get close enough to shore. Britain called for help from an unexpected source, and over 850 civilian boats answered the call, including fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, ferry boats, and tugboats, some barely 30 feet long and designed for weekend family trips, but now being sailed by their owners across the English Channel into an active war zone where death could come at any moment. The evacuation began at dawn on May 27th, with destroyers anchored offshore, while small civilian boats motored directly to the beaches, where soldiers waded into the water up to their necks with rifles held above their heads and climbed aboard fishing boats packed shoulder to shoulder, and the small vessels ferried them out to destroyers waiting in deeper water in an endless relay that continued despite constant danger. German Stukas screamed out of the sky, dropping bombs that exploded in the water and sent geysers of white foam 50 feet into the air, while fighters strafed the beaches with machine gun fire that forced soldiers to dive behind wrecked vehicles as bodies floated in the surf all around them. For 9 days, the boats kept coming back and forth across the channel, with some making 20 trips while others were destroyed, including the SS Mona's Queen that struck a mine on May 29th and sank in minutes, and the French destroyer Bourrasque that went down with hundreds of men still on deck. But the evacuation continued without pause despite these losses. By June 4th, when the last boat pulled away from Dunkirk, 338 as 226 soldiers had been rescued, even though the initial plan had called for saving just 45,000 men in 2 days, which meant they saved over 330,000 in 9 days through sheer determination and the courage of civilian boat owners who risked everything. Without Dunkirk, Britain would have lost its entire army and the war would likely have been over. But instead, those rescued soldiers lived to fight again in the campaigns that would eventually liberate Europe, which is why the British called it the Miracle of Dunkirk. The SAS concentration camp raid. On September 12, 1943, inside a ruined farmhouse 20 miles behind enemy lines in southern Italy, Major Oswald Cary L. West of the British SAS studied a hand-drawn map by candlelight that showed a concentration camp at Pasticci holding 180 Jewish prisoners who were scheduled for deportation to Auschwitz within 48 hours. The camp sat 50 miles inland in fascist-controlled territory with no Allied forces anywhere nearby, which meant that if the prisoners were going to be saved, a small team would have to go deep behind enemy lines immediately and execute a plan that bordered on complete insanity. Cary L. West assembled 12 SAS commandos and French Foreign Legion troops who had no vehicles and minimal ammunition. But they did have an idea that was either brilliant or suicidal, because at Chiatona train station, 12 miles from Pasticci, an Italian locomotive sat unguarded, and they would hijack the train, steam it 50 miles to the camp disguised as Italian guards, raid the compound, load the prisoners aboard, and steam back to Allied lines before the Germans even realized what had happened. On the night of September 13th, the SAS team stormed Chiatona station while Italian guards scattered in confusion, and the commandos climbed aboard the locomotive as black smoke billowed from its stack while wearing captured Italian uniforms, as the train lurched forward and began chugging west through darkness along enemy-held track, where discovery would mean certain death. At 3 a.m., the train pulled into Pasticci camp, where guards at the gate waved them through, assuming this was the transport train for the scheduled deportation, and the SAS team jumped off before the train even stopped with rifles raised as they shot the guards before they could shout warnings, while the camp commandant emerged from his quarters only to be captured at gunpoint. Inside the barracks, 180 prisoners slept on wooden bunks when the SAS burst through the doors, signaling silence with fingers to their lips, while starving prisoners stared in disbelief because some thought it was a German trick designed to test their loyalty. But the commandos wore British insignia beneath the stolen Italian jackets, which told the prisoners this was real, and they needed to move immediately. They moved fast because they had minutes rather than hours as prisoners stumbled onto the train, with many too weak to walk and requiring SAS troops to carry them aboard. And within 30 minutes, the train was loaded and the locomotive reversed direction, steaming east toward Allied lines with black smoke trailing behind as they raced against dawn. At first light, German patrols discovered the empty camp, but by then the train had already crossed Allied lines and all 180 prisoners were safe, pulled from the jaws of death just hours before they would have been shipped to the gas chambers. The mission remained classified for 80 years until the British government finally declassified it in 2024, revealing that the SAS had pulled off one of the most daring rescues of the war by stealing a train and raiding a concentration camp deep behind enemy lines to save 180 lives in an operation so audacious it seemed like fiction, but was absolutely real. The Wooden Horse. On October 29, 1943, inside Stalag Luft III in Nazi-occupied Poland, 3 British officers prepared to crawl through a tunnel that shouldn't exist according to everything the Germans knew about escape-proof prison design. The camp was supposedly impossible to break out of because German guards walked the perimeter every hour. Seismograph microphones buried in the sandy soil detected any underground digging, and prisoners were never left unsupervised except during their daily exercise period. which gave Flight Lieutenant Eric Williams an idea that seemed completely crazy, but just might work. Williams was a RAF pilot shot down over Germany in December 1942, and he proposed building a wooden vaulting horse for gymnastics practice that the camp guards would allow because physical exercise kept prisoners healthy and less likely to cause trouble, which meant they'd have regular and predictable access to the same spot every single day. Williams and Lieutenant Michael Codner built the horse from plywood stolen from Red Cross crates and constructed it to stand 4 feet tall but hollow inside, just wide enough for 2 men to crouch uncomfortably while being carried across the yard. Every morning at 9:01 a.m., 4 prisoners carried the horse from the recreation hut to the exact same spot in the exercise yard, 120 feet from the perimeter fence, while German guards watched from the towers as prisoners spent the next 3 hours jumping over it and practicing gymnastics. But what the guards didn't see was Williams and Codner hiding inside the hollow horse before it was lifted, and once the horse was positioned over their target spot, they started digging straight down through a trapdoor hidden in the bottom, while tunneling into the sandy soil using their hands and homemade tools as they scooped dirt into bags sewn from long underwear. When the exercise session ended at noon, they climbed back inside the horse with their bags of excavated dirt, and 4 prisoners carried the entire contraption back to the barracks with Williams and Codner hidden inside, holding their breath and trying not to make any sounds that might alert the guards to the deception, while other prisoners scattered the excavated dirt across the yard during afternoon walks by carefully mixing the distinctive yellow tunnel sand with the gray surface dirt so it wouldn't be noticed by the guards during their inspections. For 4.5 months, they dug straight down 6 feet and then horizontally 100 feet toward the fence while working in complete darkness with no wooden support beams because there was no way to hide the construction materials, which meant the tunnel could collapse at any moment and bury them alive while they felt their way forward through the narrow shaft. On the night of October 29th, Williams, Codner, and a 3rd officer named Oliver Philpott crawled through the completed tunnel and emerged beyond the wire in darkness before immediately splitting up to increase their chances of evading capture. Philpott posed as a Norwegian margarine salesman and boarded a train to Danzig, then stowed away on a Swedish ship to Stockholm and made it to safety, while Williams and Codner reached the port of Stettin and hid aboard a Danish coal ship before sailing to freedom, and all 3 made it out successfully, which made it one of the few successful breakouts from Stalag Luft III. And it worked because of a vaulting horse that the Germans watched every single day without ever suspecting what was happening right beneath their feet. The Great Escape. On March 24, 1944, inside a wooden barracks at Stalag Luft III in Nazi-occupied Poland, RAF squadron leader Roger Bushell lifted a heavy iron stove from the wall to reveal a trapdoor beneath it. And when he pulled it open, a shaft dropped 30 feet into darkness below, where 75 Allied airmen waited in the freezing barracks while preparing for an escape attempt that had been over a year in the making. Stalag Luft III sat in a pine forest 100 miles southeast of Berlin and was surrounded by barbed wire fences with guard towers rising at every corner and searchlights sweeping back and forth all night, while the sandy yellow soil that covered the ground had been deliberately chosen by the Germans because it made tunneling nearly impossible according to their calculations. Prisoners had been digging for over a year on 3 tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, with Bushell masterminding an operation that involved over 600 men working in shifts while scraping at walls with stolen spoons, snapped bed slats, and hammered tin cans as they solved the impossible problem of how to hide thousands of tons of dirt. The excavated dirt had to disappear without a trace, so prisoners stuffed sand into bags sewn from socks and tied them inside their trousers, then walked casually across the yard while pulling hidden strings to release sand through holes cut at their ankles, which dispersed it gradually across the compound so the guards wouldn't notice the distinctive yellow tunnel sand appearing on the gray surface. Below ground, men built wooden support frames from bedboards and strung stolen electrical wire along the tunnel ceiling to power dim bulbs that flickered every 20 feet, while creating just enough light to work by as the tunnel stretched 336 feet from Hut 104 and passed under the fence and guard towers toward the forest beyond. On March 24th, Bushell climbed down the ladder and crawled forward on his belly, through a tunnel that was barely 2 feet wide, and when he reached the far end and dug upward, his hands broke through frozen soil, and he looked out only to discover the tunnel was 15 feet short and opened in exposed ground before reaching the tree line, which meant every escaper would be visible for those crucial seconds. Men kept crawling out anyway and lay flat in the snow while waiting for searchlights to pass before sprinting for the trees, until the 77th man climbed out and a guard spotted movement in the darkness, which caused searchlights to lock onto the exit as a siren wailed and gunfire cracked, and the escape was suddenly over. Within 3 days, the Gestapo had recaptured 73 of the 76 escapees, and Hitler personally ordered their execution in retaliation by sending agents to shoot 50 prisoners in the back of the head before cremating their bodies to hide the war crime. Only 3 men made it to freedom because 2 Norwegians reached Sweden by boat, and 1 Dutchman walked through occupied France and Spain all the way to Gibraltar, which made the Great Escape the most famous POW breakout in history, even though it cost 50 lives from men who died for the principle that it was their duty to try to escape and tie up German resources, no matter the personal cost. Operation Begonia. On September 9, 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies, and within hours, German forces moved aggressively to secure the country and capture thousands of Allied POWs held in Italian camps before they could be freed, which prompted British command to launch Operation Begonia as an emergency airborne mission designed to extract prisoners before the Germans arrived and transferred them to camps in Germany, where escape would be virtually impossible. Intelligence reported that Allied POWs were scattered across multiple camps in central Italy, while German units were already moving south at high speed as they raced to secure the prisoners before the British could reach them, which meant the British had hours or maybe a day at most to get them out before the window closed completely. Paratroopers from the 2nd Independent Parachute Brigade were dispatched immediately in an operation that was chaotic by necessity, with planes dropping troops near multiple camps simultaneously, while paratroopers hit the ground running toward the compounds without knowing what they'd find. At some camps, Italian guards simply opened the gates and walked away because they had no interest in continuing to hold prisoners for a government that had just surrendered. While at other camps, confusion reigned as German advance units approached, and paratroopers had to organize prisoners into columns and begin marching them toward Allied lines before they could be cut off by enemy forces. Some camps were too far behind enemy lines to reach in time, and those prisoners were left behind to be transferred to German camps where they would spend the rest of the war under much harsher conditions. Over 3 days, Operation Begonia, alongside its sister mission, Operation Jonquil, extracted over 10,000 Allied POWs from Italian camps just ahead of German forces, which meant that for 10,000 men, September 1943 marked the end of their imprisonment after being pulled out in a desperate race against time, while thousands more weren't reached fast enough and spent the remainder of the war in German captivity in what became a bittersweet outcome that saved many lives but couldn't save them all.